أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum dear students. I hope all of you will be doing fine and having great time along with your families. In our previous lecture we have been talking about the Vietnam War in the context of the development of the Cold War in the Asian continent. So today we would try to talk about one of the most significant events of the international politics that threatened the world with nuclear catastrophe in the earlier years of 1960s, uh, and that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that event is considered as one of the major crisis uh, which put the entire world at the risk of nuclear catastrophe in the Cold War era. So today we would try to have a brief overview of this Cuban Missile Crisis, and I would try to complete this topic in our next lecture, because it might not be possible for us to conclude this whole lecture, like whole topic, in one lecture. So I would like you to have a look at this picture. In this picture we can see that both the Kennedy and Khrushchev, the respective leaders of both the US and the former Soviet Union at that time, they are like found engaged in a sort of power show. And if we closely look at this picture, we can see them sitting on the missiles which can carry the nukes, and they are about to both of them are about to push or they trigger the button for nuclear launch. So this picture demonstrates the threatening situation which was there in the earlier 1960s, that put the whole world at the risk of nuclear catastrophe at that time. These were the two major powers highly equipped with the nuclear stockpiles, and if that had been occurred, that would have been the total annihilation of the world, maybe. So now we will talk about we will start with the overthrow of the Fulgencio Batista's rule in the Cuba. So before that, I would like to present you with a brief overview of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the world stood on the brink of a nuclear war. The Soviet Union had secretly stationed nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba, and when the government of the United States discovered that the nuclear missiles have been stationed, or the Cuba has been provided with those weapons by the former Soviet Union, they demanded their withdrawal. The US demanded their withdrawal, and most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War followed. A single miscalculation made either in the United States or in the Soviet Union could have precipitated the catastrophe. the nuclear catastrophe. So, by the end of our lecture, by the end of the discussion about this topic, we would like to pose some questions for you. I would like to pose some questions for you, that reads as: how did this standoff arise? How did the superpowers extricate themselves from it? And was anything learned from the crisis? And the last one: should any party be held more at fault than the other? So, by the end of the discussion about the Cuban Missile Crisis, we would like to have we would like to have an analysis of these questions, who could have been held more responsible for this event which threatened the peace of the entire world. So, talking about the Cuban Revolution and the overthrow of the Fulgencio Batista, the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista was riddled with corruption and didn't serve the interest of the Cuban people. In January 1959, Fulgencio Batista, the brutal and American-backed Cuban dictator, was overthrown by the guerrilla army of the Fidel Castro. Initially, President Eisenhower's administration welcomed the Cuban Revolution, for Batista had long been an embarrassing ally and a friendly democratic government in Cuba. Addressing urgent social reforms would be far more stable and reliable. Yet such views did not last long. So the Eisenhower administration, while facing the overthrow of the Fulgencio Batista, which didn't serve the US interest, though he has been backed heavily by the US government. So initially they welcomed the overthrow of the Fulgencio Batista by the Fidel Castro, and hoped that the revolutionary government and the US government could find a place for cooperation, and they could serve each other interest. But that view didn't last long. Many major Cuban industries like sugar refineries, tobacco, oil, tourism, and gaming were controlled by the American interest, and the Batista regime, which was enforced before the revolution. And the ground fact was that, like, most of the Cubans were struggling with poverty, like they were living in a sort of beyond the poverty line. So when we talk about the American interest in Cuba, for America, Cuba provided a naval base at Guantanamo. It was an exotic but conveniently close tourist resort, and low paid Cuban labor made it an attractive investment area. Much of the island's agriculture and industry being American owned. So, for all these factors, that Cuban island presented American with so many interest, and hence the government in Washington had never hesitated to intervene to protect American interest. The problem was that Castro could never tackle desperate problems of poverty, ill health, and illiteracy without harming US interests. So, indeed, to Castro and to the large proportion of the Cuban people, American domination was a root cause of the Cuban problems, and it must be ended. Castro, in fact, articulated a widespread revulsion against this humiliating position. The United States was deeply detested on this island. So most of the Cuban people, they held the U.S. government responsible for most of their grievances and most of their issues. So it was considered that without harming the U.S. interest, the it might not have been possible to wage a development struggle inside Cuba by the Castro government. So in 1959, Fidel Castro, along with his brother Raul Castro and the Argentinian revolutionary Che Guevara, they led a successful military revolt against the Batista government, and they removed Batista from power in 1959. So, as American property was expropriated by the new government, Castro's defeated enemies were treated mercilessly and elections were postponed while Castro secured his grip on power. Yet, as ever more vicious anti American diatribes came from the new leader, his popularity in Cuba grew. In the United States, however, he became increasingly unacceptable. Eisenhower therefore decided that Castro was a communist. So the question can be raised whether this was true then or not is highly debatable. But Castro was certainly to turn to communism in the face of US hostility. So when we first say that he was a communist and the US was quite concerned about that, and because of that they launched a sort of military campaign against Castro's regime in Cuba. That might not have been true at that time, but the one fact which was quite certain, that in the face of rising US hostility, the Castro's regime would definitely have gone for a protection from the Soviet Union at that time, because the world structure was bipolar at that time and the world got divided into two blocks at that time. So it was a quite easily understandable fact that by facing a hostility from the US, Cuba might have asked would definitely have asked for help from the Soviets. So Eisenhower ordered the CIA to overthrow him, and the CIA orchestrated sabotage raids on Cuba to destabilize the regime of Castro. Several attempts were made to assassinate Castro, reputedly using the mafias. The first of at least 8 assassination attempts was planned as early as August 1960. Also, the economic sanctions were imposed, especially against Cuba's sugar crop, which was its main export commodity. Yet, rather than undermine Castro, this hostility made him more secure and an increasingly bitter and vocal enemy of the United States. So, in the logic of the Cold War, this made him a potential partner of the Soviet Union. Steadily growing ties with the USSR made him appear a growing threat to the US hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, which could not be tolerated by the US. So, this was the only state which was going towards the communist bloc at that time in the Western Hemisphere, and US could not tolerate this development. So this is the picture of Fulgencio Batista, the American-backed dictator, which had been overthrown by the Castro and his brother and Argentinian Che Guevara. So these are the two pictures of Fidel Castro. One was taken in 1959 when he emerged as a revolutionary, and the other one was taken after 50 years. And this is the picture of Raul Castro. He was the brother of Fidel Castro and the current leader of Cuba. I would again verify this very information whether he is still in power or not. And this is the Argentinian who helped the two brothers to successfully oust the government of Fulgencio Batista. The one picture was taken in 1959, and he got killed in Bolivia in 1967. So now we will talk about one of the significant events of this Cuban Missile Crisis, and that is the Bay of Pigs invasion that occurred in 1961. So among the steps taken by the CIA to remove Castro, a brigade of about 1400 anti-Castro Cuban exiles was raised. Those who were against the Castro regime and those who have been exiled from Cuba, they have been converted into a sort of brigade by the CIA to overthrow the Castro regime. The CIA decided to use this force in a large-scale invasion of the island with the backing of its air force. So initially it was planned that a full-fledged invasion will be launched against Castro and with the help of the US Air Force. This, it was assumed, would trigger mass risings and overthrow Castro regime. So it was anticipated by the Americans, like the CIA officials at that time, that mass uprising would be ensued in the Cuba, and eventually the Castro regimes will be overthrown. Yet Eisenhower, who had after all been supreme elite commander, recognized the risk of failure and resultantly hesitated to launch this full-scale attack. His successor in January 1961, that is John F. Kennedy, who assumed power after him, would be left to decide whether or not to launch the invasion or not. So eventually it was John F. Kennedy who was left with this decision to make whether to launch this invasion or not. So this plan of a full-scale invasion planned by the CIA that went through some sort of uncertainty because of the one factor was the change of the leadership in the United States at that time, and the other factor was the response from the international community. Perhaps Castro hoped that a new president would be less hostile to his revolution. If so, he hoped in vain. Kennedy, he had used Cuba repeatedly in the election campaign, accusing his Republican opponents of being soft on communism, insisting that Cuba was America's most glaring failure, one that endangered the whole Western Hemisphere. So, when we talk about the Castro's perception about the new leadership in the United States of America, if he had perceived that the new administration in the United States would seek cooperation with the revolutionary government installed in Cuba, he would have thought in vain, like it was because in the election campaign, John F. Kennedy used the Cuban crisis a lot to win votes by the American people against the Republican counterpart. So, this rhetoric would be difficult to forget once Kennedy was in office. Business interest alarmed that if Castro was left unpunished, he might start a fashion for nationalizing US investments in Latin America, and vocal Cuban exile groups were determined not to allow him to forget it. So, it was quite difficult for the Kennedy administration to forget about those promises which they made in the election campaign with the people. And as we already discussed, that a lot of business interest of the Americans were involved in the Cuba, and those interest groups didn't let the Kennedy forget about those promises which he made in the during the election campaign, and the Kennedy was ready to deal with the Castro regimes with heavy hand rather than having a soft corner for the revolutionary government installed in the Cuba. Furthermore, Kennedy seems to have been personally offended by Castro, who had defied the might of the United States and refused to be intimidated. Castro's survival was an affront to American pride. Kennedy became obsessed with the fear that Castro might prove able to export this revolution to other Latin American nations. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara later admitted the administration was hysterical over Castro. Kennedy was even more hostile to Castro than Eisenhower had been, and a great deal less cautious. So, among the other fears which the American administration in general and Kennedy in particular had in mind, one of those were that they were scared of this thought that Castro might export this revolutionary movement to other Latin American countries. So he was quite hostile. He was much more hostile to Castro than the Eisenhower, and he was not very conscious while dealing with the Castro about the consequences. So Kennedy was probably unaware that there were risks attached to the CIA's plan. He approved the project, which was put together in a remarkably slipshod manner. Mass risings were expected on the basis of nothing more than wishful thinking. Virtually nothing seems to have been done to prepare a new government that might enjoy some degree of popular support. If no mass risings occurred, then the brigade of Cuban exiles was expected to withdraw into the interior and launch a guerrilla campaign. But the chosen landing ground, called the Bay of Pigs, led only to swamp, and so there was no possibility of this happening. So the most of the plans which were made by the CIA, they were based on aspirations. They didn't properly work out on the plan to launch a full scale, large scale invasion through the Bay of Pigs in 1961. And even the land which was chosen for landing, and they assumed that the Cuban exiles would follow the tactics of guerrilla. The land where they landed was not suitable. It was a swamp, and there was no possibility to employ guerrilla tactics. So that shows the lack of planning by the CIA to plan this whole invasion. Most bizarrely, Kennedy was convinced it would be possible to launch this invasion without the world being aware of the American involvement. And another factor was that shows the lack of planning behind this invasion, that the Kennedy thought that perhaps the world might be unaware of all this development, but this was something which was quite difficult to hide from the world community. He felt he could convince the international community that Cubans were liberating themselves using only their own resources, yet as there was already speculations in the press that the CIA was planning an invasion, this belief was quite astonishing. Kennedy appears to have been swept along by the sense of urgency and warnings that the whole idea was half baked, half baked. For example, from Under Secretary of State Chester Bowles were ignored. So Kennedy was not only one to delude himself, he made it very clear to the CIA that US forces would not intervene if the plan went awry. Senior CIA officers, however, aware of the weakness of the plan, remained convinced that once the invasion was launched, the US prestige would be so bound up in its success that Kennedy would have to support it. Perhaps this explains why in April 1961 they were willing to commit about 1400 ill-trained, poorly equipped exiles to what became a humiliating fiasco for the Americans. Everything that could go wrong did so. Air attacks failed to destroy Castro's air force completely. Most of the ammunition and communications equipment was destroyed before it could be landed. Castro's forces fought well and enjoyed massive popular support. There were no risings, and US forces did nothing to support the exiles. Within 2 days after, 100 exiles had been killed and nearly 1200 had surrendered. So, in short, recapping the background of the events in Cuba, we can say that Cuba, a small island 90 miles from the coast of Florida, was the center of this adversity, and it was the US ally, and it is used as a military base as well, and it is served as a like another market for US businesses. And in 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows Batista, which was a US backed dictator, and established the communist government there. And then in 1959, Castro, along with his brother and Che Guevara, overthrew the government of Batista. And in 1961, there was a break-off of diplomatic relations with the United States. And in April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred, and around 1400 anti-Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Castro, which were badly failed in their in invasions. And in the autumn of 1962, Cuba has received hundreds of USSR missiles, jet boats, and personnel. So this whole adventure got converted into a Cold War enterprise between the US and the former Soviet Union. So this is all about today's lecture, and I would share some reading material with you guys about this very topic, and in the next lecture we would try to conclude our topic. So until then, all the best, and I wish all of you would stay happy and healthy. See you next week. Allah Hafiz. Guys have any queries, would specify him in our